The town of Chelmsford acknowledges that its land upon which the government buildings, town common, and libraries are situated is the traditional and ancestral territory of many diverse Indigenous nations, and we strive to honor these peoples. We acknowledge the history of genocide and forced removal from this land, now known as Chelmsford, and we honor the Indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we live, work, and learn. This area comprises in part the homelands of the Pawtucket, Pennacook, Abenaki, and their close neighbors, the Massachusetts and Nipmuc peoples. The town of Chelmsford extends our deepest respect to citizens of these nations who live here and elsewhere today, and to their ancestors who have lived here for generations. If you'd like to see the full text of the land acknowledgement and the proclamation that was passed by the town earlier this year, you can go to www.chelmsfordlibrary.org/land-acknowledgement. Tonight, as part of our Compelling Questions series, we're asking, how can we support Indigenous sovereignty and urban Indian survivance? We have online with us Jean-Luc Piret. Originally from New Orleans, Louisiana, Jean-Luc now resides in Jamaica Plain. Prior to his election to the board of directors, Jean-Luc was also elected to the community linguist seat of the advisory circle for Colang for the period of 2016 to 2020. The Institute on Collaborative Language Research, or Colang, is designed to provide an opportunity for community language activists and linguists to receive training in community-based language, documentation, and revitalization. Currently, Jean-Luc volunteers with his tribe's Language and Culture Revitalization Program, which is a collaboration with Tulane University in New Orleans. This program is based on the tradition passed from Jean-Luc's great-grandfather, Joseph Alcide Piret, Sr., the last traditional chief and medicine man of the Tunica Biloxi. The tribe is an amalgamation of members from the central Louisiana communities of Tunica, Biloxi, Choctaw, Ofo, and Avoyelles. The North American Indian Center of Boston, NICOB, has been empowering and investing in the Native American community of Massachusetts for over 45 years. From language revitalization to food assistance to employment training, NAICOB provides a wide range of cultural, social, educational, and professional services to Native peoples in the Commonwealth. Tonight, Jean-Luc Piret, NAICOB's president of the board, will lead us in an engaging conversation on Indigenous sovereignty and the ways that you, as a community member, can get involved and support the North American Indian Center of Boston's mission. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Jean-Luc. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Jess, and really happy to be here. Really grateful to Chelmsford Library for extending the invitation, and looking forward to a really engaging conversation. After I run through my slideshow here, I definitely want folks to just kind of take notes, but then also kind of open up the discussion, not just on things that I've been presenting, but definitely all of your questions that I may or may not have touched upon during this presentation. So tonight, the title of the talk is Compelling Questions: How Can We Support Indigenous Sovereignty and Urban Indian Survivance? Of course, this is a picture on this title screen. This is a picture from last year when Acting Mayor Kim Janey declared it by executive order Indigenous Peoples Day in lieu of Christopher Columbus Day. And I usually like to start with this picture because it actually shows a lot of the diversity of what we now call our urban Indigenous community. Of course, we have representatives from our host tribe, the Massachusetts tribe at Ponkapog, but also we have members of our staff, people that are Mi'kmaq, my executive Joe Dadan, Gloria Colon, my executive director Raquel Halsey, who's Mandan, Hidatsa, and Rikara. our very close partner organization, United American Indians in New England, co-lead Matoin Monroe, Lakota, Charlie Nauru from the United Confederation of Taino Peoples, Sebastian Ebarb, Choctaw Apache. We have Nayeli here and Mia, who are also other bands of Apache. Myself, going down to the first row, you have Reggie Alkevich, who is Inuk and Haitian. To their left, to their right, excuse me, is Keisha James, who is from the Aquinnah Wampanoag. Jenny Oliver, again, Massachusetts tribe of Hunkapaw. Actually, that's a member of Monum right there, and then my employment and training director, Ella Jake Black Owl, who's Pawnee. So, really diverse mix of people that are within our own community that kind of encapsulate all of North America, the Caribbean as well, peoples that have relationships across the southern borders, across the northern borders. So this is who we serve when we're talking about the urban indigenous community. Also, when we're talking about urban Indian centers, places in which people find community, people are provided with cultural and social services. We're also talking about a time in which the United States Congress actually took actions against our indigenous nations, talking about the 1950s when Congress was leading in the efforts to terminate tribal status and leading towards urban relocation of peoples. And so we have peoples that are finding community and actually finding ways to reconnect with those cultural roots. Of course, language revitalization is a big part of that, but also sort of like this revitalization of the sense of native pride. And also, I share this picture, and I always point back to the fact that while Indigenous Peoples Day, in lieu of Christopher Columbus Day, lands a certain way, one way or the other, here locally in Massachusetts, this picture was actually shared by an outlet in Brazil by the name of Media Ninja. On Instagram, for some folks that are pretty savvy, let's just say like a lot of people, tens of thousands of people actually, double tapped on this picture and said that they liked this picture. And I actually kind of think about this moment captured in this picture and the way that it resonated internationally in that way, that the first Black woman mayor of Boston declared it Indigenous Peoples Day. And we have this just sort of the diversity here of Indigenous peoples that are portrayed within this picture, and how much that deeply resonated with the electorate down there in Brazil, and how even in more recent times, when we look back on the presidential election and sort of the election of Lula over Bolsonaro, who was taking very anti-Indigenous, very anti-rights of nature. These are the types of things that we're kind of faced with when it comes to sort of like structural challenges, but that grassroots resonating effect is still there. So I just wanted to kind of like, definitely kind of sear this into everybody's mind's eye as we're going through this presentation about who exactly we're talking about. One thing that I have I wanted to kind of like put out there as well is that part of my background, I've actually am involved with several distributed networks for education, whether it's in life sciences, whether it's in STEM, STEAM, or language documentation. The one that's in life sciences is Global Community Bio Summit. Last year, they awarded me with the inaugural LaDonna Bray Bull Allard Science Activist Award. And what does that mean? LaDonna Brable Allard, who you see off to the right-hand side with me, she was actually a proponent of not just sort of like what does it mean to be out there doing direct actions and advocating for climate justice from an Indigenous lens, but she was actually a science teacher as well, and really advocating for our own ways of knowing. I position that with my grandmother, who is from the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians from the Standing Pine community. She was the first Choctaw woman to graduate from a four-year college in Mississippi, and went on to become a teacher. Actually, she was the first Choctaw woman to teach within a white school in Mississippi. And I put these pictures side by side because, you know, from a very personal standpoint, in 2018 on my birthday, I lost my grandmother. But less than a week after that, I met LaDonna Brapel, and at that time, she gave me sort of that grandmother energy that I was so missing because of the loss of my grandmother. And so I just kind of like carry both of these legacies now in advocating for our sciences and our ways of knowing. So this is a vision board that I composed within a workshop facilitated by the organization known as Gadakana. North American Indian Center, Boston. We are in Jamaica Plain, historically within the older borders of Roxbury and Boston. But where we are in Jamaica Plain, I actually used to live not too far from the center itself, but I would go to Jamaica Pond almost daily, especially during the beginning of the pandemic. And I was forming a relationship with the land. And so what this vision board is actually sort of expressing is my own journey of kind of making sense of of the land and my own personal surroundings, going from a very academic sort of like understanding, looking at, you know, older texts, looking at portraits from settlers as far as like, you know, what Native people, Indigenous peoples looked like at a certain time, but then actually kind of having a more personal connection with the land, finding things such as like when the swans were coming back to the pond, finding works of art such as what's pictured here in the middle. It's a little bit hard to see, but it's actually a metal work of a woman holding the earth within her womb. And then we also have the Francis Parkman monument that overlooks Jamaica Pond. Now, this monument itself, it does have a relief, a very prominent relief of a native figure, but by you know, Jamaica Plain historians, this figure is actually a composite. This figure is somebody that doesn't necessarily have his or their own identity memorialized within this monument. Of course, this monument is more so for that plaque that's underneath, which actually has a relief of the bust of Francis Parkman, who wrote about tribes and wrote about especially Pontiac. And so, you know, in terms of like making this monument part of my own process of connecting with the land and with the identity of Native peoples around the land, I actually found myself having to sort of like interpret it in my own way, sort of like put my own values in terms of like actually relating to this monument. And as you can see on this monument itself, this is actually 2020, summer of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, after we saw a lot of the people taking to the streets. You can see that people were attaching their own values and their own demands to this monument themselves. And so overall, this vision board is expressing this journey, but I show this because first and foremost, people ask us, what does it mean to make a land acknowledgement? And making a land acknowledgement means expressing that personal connection with the land, going beyond what we can actually research or Google, research in books or Google on the internet, whatever. It's about that every day to day, making connections with the people that have come before us, making connections even with non-human actors, such as the geese, such as the waters. This is overall how we sort of express those relationships and how we base the actions that we're going to carry forward when we do statements such as land acknowledgements. And so, what is the overall temperature of the moment here? I have three stories I'm going to go through briefly. This picture being of Anishinaabe cousins, activists that actually led a direct action to disrupt a mass led by Pope Francis as he was making his tour of so-called Canada. And this was actually an apology tour in response to the recovery of the remains of children that were lost to residential schools that were facilitated by the state, facilitated by the church. And for these cousins, it wasn't just enough for the Pope to have an apology for the First Nations people, but they're calling for the rescinding of the doctrine of discovery, a very foundational set of documents known as papal bulls, but basically the church kind of carving up the world for the princes of Europe to go out and to exploit indigenous peoples and leaving us with a legacy of stolen land, stolen lives, stolen labor, and so forth. And so, definitely have to repeat that, we do need a recension of this doctrine of discovery. Secondly, this is a picture of BJ Gachi from the Leech Lake Ojibwe people. He's actually standing within a thriving forest and advocating for their own way of doing ecological preservation through controlled burns. This is in a way sort of like pushing forward our ways of knowing and our traditional ecological knowledge, but doing the sort of like land management and asserting self-determination over those realms of land management, but not so much just to like kind of have some sense of economic development for his own nation. This is actually cultivate spaces in which his fellow his relations can go into these spaces and actually be able to hold ceremony, to hold dances, to be able to speak their language. What can they do to cultivate land in a way that actually is generative and reaffirming of their traditions? And so it kind of like just reflect on that story. And then finally, also recently, within the last year, we have the story of the Mohegan people actually rematriating documents from Dartmouth College. Dartmouth College being, of course, originally founded for Indian education. Their ancestor, Samson Occam, did a whole tour of Europe advocating and trying to raise funds for Dartmouth College for the purpose of Indian education. Now, by sort of the testimony of the Native American Student Association in 1970, Dartmouth existed for over 200 years and only graduated 20 indigenous peoples. And so this sort of act of rematriation between the college and between the Mohican people, who they originally sort of exploited, is in a way sort of like restoring the dignity and or repairing the relationship between the university and between the native people, and done so in a ceremonial way which affirms the knowledge of the people. And so these are some of the things that we're actually kind of um, talking about not just sort of like rematriation of land, rematriation of sacred objects or human remains, but also the intellectual property of Indigenous peoples. So I also like to talk about value systems. And there are two different things that I juxtapose within this section of the talk. One coming from my own tribal history. On the left hand, you see a medal from the King of Spain, and you see a sort of historical blurb here where Bernardo de Galvez actually kind of affirms that my ancestors were sort of friends of His Royal Majesty, and were given titles, were given medals. This is a way in which we cultivated nation-to-nation relationships before the United States took over the Louisiana Territory. But this is also like a very top-down way of having a value system. I juxtapose that with what's still being practiced here in New England. You actually see these are the hands of Stephen Peters, and he's holding a wampum belt that was being exhibited in the United Kingdom. These wampum belts, they're actually taken, each bead is processed from quahog shells, and you see these patterns of white and purple beads, and it's actually telling a story. It's actually telling, sort of the values of the community itself. And these wampum belts were actually used to sort of affirm treaties between the nations. And so you see a very grassroots way in which value is generated and pulled together and encoded within these artifacts. Also, with these quahog shells, we have the shell middens that are along the New England coast right now. These shell middens were, originally these are just sort of like food refuse, but you actually, within these middens, you actually have cultural resources that are embedding thousands of years of history. And because they're along the New England coast, they're actually endangered by rising sea levels and coastal erosion. And so there's a need to protect those shell middens that are along our coasts. But one thing that I want to kind of like emphasize, these past two examples that I pointed to, these are both quahog shells. These are both clam shells. The shell middens themselves, encapsulate thousands of years of history or data. The wampum belts are an encoding of international treaties and actually using purple and white beads in this sort of binary logic. And so think about wampum belts as software, and think about shell middens as sort of like hard drives. This is indigenous technologies that date back to thousands of years. And then I also kind of like bring in, some of the indigenous futurism that, is now being expressed. And I'm actually going to go through it a little bit later. But this is on the right-hand side, you see examples from Chinupa Hanska Luger in his future ancestral technologies exhibit. This is in a way sort of like basing an older oral tradition, but then projecting the continuance and the survivance of Indigenous peoples hundreds of years into the future, telling a story about our relationship with the buffalo, and then telling relationships about how we rebuild the world by reclaiming technologies that were discarded and left behind after a mass exodus into space. So these are the types of stories that we're kind of cultivating going forward. Is like, yes, keeping those older oral traditions, but allowing us the freedom to kind of like imagine new and different futures. So that kind of goes into my own research. I actually did a master's in Barcelona, starting in September of 2020 and ending in July of 2021. Um, through my program, it was called the Master in Design for Emergent Futures. It was at the Institute of Advanced Architecture Catalonia in Barcelona. But through my program, I actually was asking a couple of questions. One, how can we acknowledge emergence origins? And I'm going to just talk about that in a second. But most importantly, how could we sustain balance now as future ancestors? So thinking about ourselves in relation to space and time. Space, meaning that coming from my own oral tradition, my tribe knows very specifically where geographically we emerged from. We can always go back to those same earthen mounds and kind of pay respects to our ancestors, pay respects to those that were left behind in the underworld, in those watery dimensions. And I always wondered, what if everybody was able to have that type of specificity? What if everybody was able to kind of like retrace everything and kind of find out, you know, what is it, where is my family from? Where are my roots? And then how does, knowing my roots actually inform my lived experience where I'm at now? So how can I be my whole complete self in the place where I am? And then having that positionality, then projecting myself into time, how can I then sustain balance within the present state with the consciousness that I'm an ancestor for generations into the future? And so talking about Indigenous futurism, talking about the future scouting that I was doing within my master's, I was actually we were using this thing called the Atlas Week signals. You see on the left-hand side, you see some examples of the cards that we were using, thinking about fighting Anthropocene conflicts, all of the movement politics that we're faced with right now, but then also sort of imagining futures that are not Western centric, and then contextualizing that future scouting with these genres of Indigenous futurism, which I was basing off of the anthology Walking the Clouds, edited by Grace Dillon. Actually, in fall of 2019, before the pandemic, I was hosting a reading series at North American Indian Center of Boston, going through each of these. We were meeting on the new moon and then the full moon, reading all of these stories, and then kind of like thinking about what are the different artifacts that we could make to kind of like express these future visions. And what are the genres themselves? Talking about native slipstream, talking about non-linear ways of thinking, navigating through past and presents and futures, all in one stream. Or thinking about native apocalypse, not necessarily like, nuclear war or anything like that, but like going into a state of imbalance, and thinking about like all of those different apocalypses that we've suffered up to this point, talking about like the stolen generation, stolen land, yes, but even more recently, all the children that were lost, to residential and boarding schools. Even yesterday, when we're hearing about challenges to the Indian Child Welfare Act, and sort of the anxiety of what it means to actually kind of be faced going back to those realities in which we have stolen generations. Of course, we have other genres such as Contact, thinking about those narratives where aliens and humans come into encountering each other, and what does that mean? What are the sort of intertwined colonial narratives that go along with that? Definitely Indigenous science and sustainability, all of the things that I've been talking about, those different ways of knowing, and all of those sort of continuities between wampum quahog shells, wampum beads, and binary logic and Indigenous technologies. But overall, how can we get back to the sense of this Anishinaabe word, Biskabiang, or returning to ourselves, thinking about, how we've been affected by colonization, but then, just eschewing all of the baggage that comes with it, and just adapting to the post-native apocalypse world and returning to that sense of balance, which is something that we've always been able to do. I'm going to just do a quick time check. These are a couple, I'm going to go through these a little bit more quickly because I do want to save some time for questions. But these are two examples of projects that I took on while I was in my master's. One was at a single room scale, one was at a city-wide scale. Post-native apocalypse curating, we have a room within North American Indian Center, Boston. And we have all of these sort of like texts and artifacts that we never, as a nonprofit, we don't really have the capacity to do all of the careful curation that needs to be done. And in terms of the intervention on the left, I took it upon myself to actually kind of like stay within this room for 24 hours, live with all of these artifacts and texts and everything, and kind of come up with my own system of archiving, curating all of this data that we have. Going from that local single room intervention into actually going to Barcelona itself and being confronted with the language barrier of having to learn Catalan. Well, not knowing Catalan, let's say. I actually took it upon myself to go throughout the whole neighborhood, and everywhere I found Catalan printed on the walls, I actually took pictures of, and then I transcribed the text. And then I found tools that would actually take the text that I was transcribing and turn it into computer-generated speech, and then ultimately like came up with a small Instagram account, which kind of like promoted the work that I was doing. One thing that was compelling about this project was that even though I was going from the context of being an Indigenous person within the United States to being an immigrant within Catalonia, I actually was finding ways to actually connect with the community because there are people within Catalonia that are very concerned about the status of Catalan within the online realm. And so what I was doing in terms of making sense of my own landscape, and especially kind of focusing on the graffiti, the ephemeral, and yet the immediate expression of needs and priorities of community, I was actually overall contributing to the preservation of Catalan within the online space, and kind of like aligning my experience with my background and my family's work in doing language and cultural revitalization for our own community. So finding commonality within those spaces. I just wanted to kind of like also bring into the discussion, we have been working on a resource guide for Native American, Indigenous, Two-Spirit, and LGBTQ youth in Massachusetts. This is a collaboration with the LGBTQ Youth Commission. We have many different things. We've actually been working in coalition spaces with other Indigenous community centers, such as American Indian Community House, in New York, thinking about like all the ways in which we kind of like bring art and design and ground it in the spirituality. This is again talking about the children that were lost to residential schools. This is an example of a project that I did in Barcelona collaboratively with the designers that were there, kind of bridging understanding between them and their context, and what could they do to actually support the call to justice for those children that were lost to residential schools. And then working and bringing a lot of these design skills to our own community. These are two projects that were designed by our community members. The one on the left being made by Charlie Naru, the one on the right being made by one of our Mi'kmaq. I believe this was Julia Galvez, but it was one of our Mi'kmaq community members. But her grandmother's name was Rose, and she kind of came up with this piece that would sit by her grandmother's grave and actually collect petals within this reflecting pool. These are both examples of interventions that came out of this 1-by-1 challenge, in which we worked with an architecture professor from MIT. And then he came up with the call to action of like, if we could make something that was 1 foot by 1 foot, 1 meter by 1 meter, whatever it is, what could we do and put on the land that would actually express our connection to the land? And so these are examples of things that not only art pieces, but ways in which NACOB is actually bridging those gaps and making sure that our community members attain these skills. And then finally, or maybe close to finally, this is, again, talking about that connection to land, talking about land acknowledgements, and what can we do to actually embody these expressions. I actually worked with Hampshire College out in Amherst, Mass, and did a residency there during the spring semester. And what you see on the right is a woven hoop that was installed during a Native Crossroads festival. But each of these ribbons, we invited the community to come in and write on each of these ribbons their own connection to the land. And so you see the sort of like going back to that example of wampum belts. What can the community do when it comes together to actually express and affirm their relationship to the land, and what it is that they would do to support Indigenous peoples? And that was from the community. The president of Hampshire College. It actually, this piece itself and the work that was attached to it, we actually used that to actually kind of instill some institutional change at Hampshire College. Of course, if you're familiar with Hampshire College, it's a very movement-based and very, innovative school that I was really happy to work with. Yeah, and finally, we have events that we come together and we do speak outs. We go into the public square. We're here at the Cathedral of the Holy Cross on September 30th, which is Orange Shirt Day, in which we kind of express survivor stories from these residential and boarding schools, and from the families that are impacted by this legacy. We've done speak outs on Orange Shirt Day, Indigenous Peoples Day. We're still marching within Boston, and then coming up on this last Thursday of this month, we have National Day of Mourning, which when I get back and you can see my background, you'll see sort of like Plymouth, where we go. We start at Coles Hill and then make our way around the public square, and you'll hear from different Indigenous peoples from across the Americas. So that's my presentation. I'm definitely glad for all of you being here, for your patience while I was kind of going through my own journey. Of course, we also have to mention the Massachusetts Indigenous Legislative Agenda. Of course, if anybody wants to ask me about that, I can go ahead and give an answer to that. But I definitely wanted to, at this point, open it up for conversation and for your questions and for your thoughts. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to having a dialogue with you. And I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna put it into gallery view. Well, actually, what I'll do is I'll pull up really quickly, since you might be ruminating over what it is that you might want to talk about. I'm going to go ahead and pull up and do another share screen here. This website is maindigenousagenda.org. And this actually talks about the Massachusetts Indigenous Legislative Agenda. We have a slate of 5 bills that we have. We've been filing 5 bills this past legislative session. The session before, we actually had another bill that was a part of the slate, which was the bill to establish a special commission relative to the seal and motto of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. That actually passed. And earlier this year, I believe it was in May, the commission itself decided to support a completely new revision to that seal. So we still have some progress to do to get that process fully completed. But we can kind of celebrate those victories as we have them. The bills that you're looking at right now, these are the current bills, and will be refiled in the coming session. We actually weren't able to get them to a floor vote. But usually when people ask us, how can they support, especially as citizens of Massachusetts, these are one of the hot button things that we really want people to show up for. Indigenous Peoples Day was perhaps, like, as we were told by legislators, one of the highest testified to bills within the session. So this is something that there's kind of there's no debate about this. There really should be a consensus that we do need Indigenous Peoples Day to replace Christopher Columbus Day. But we're still at a point where we weren't able to get that to a floor vote, so we do have to refile. Protecting Native American heritage means refining the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act enforcement to include all publicly funded entities within the Commonwealth. So, I'm talking, to you here for the Chelmsford Public Library. There was another public library, unfortunately, in 2018, which, in the interest of renovating the library, I think it was Medford. So November 2018, the Medford Public Library was seeking to renovate their library, and they put up a set of sacred objects on auction at Skinner Auctioneers here in Boston. When we heard about this at North American Indian Center of Boston, we said that it was unconscionable. This should never happen. I mean, this is something that would happen in Paris auction houses. Why is that happening here? And so we have Protect Native American Heritage bill in order to actually make sure that those situations don't happen again. removing racist mascots. Before going into 2020, there were over 40 public schools with Native mascots. With the renewed call for racial and social justice following the murder of George Floyd, we definitely owe a lot to Black Lives Matter and those renewed calls for the taking down of many of those mascots. And yet this is a problem that still persists within the Commonwealth. We're hoping to celebrate and teach Native American culture and history, and do so in an interdisciplinary way throughout public school curriculum, throughout all of the years. So how can we have a more integrated curriculum? And then finally, talking about having a commission relative to the educational outcomes of American Indians and Alaska Natives, our youth who are impacted disproportionately by in-school or out-of-school discipline, disproportionately impacted by rates of suicide. All of these things that we're talking about, mascots, Indigenous Peoples Day, the ways in which we regard our sacred objects and human remains, all of these things combined, even the ways in which we affirm the knowledge of the home through public school curriculum, these exacerbate the sort of like the achievement rights of our Native American youth, of our American Indian Alaska Native youth. And so, when I talk about these bills, I talk about these bills within a system, and how can we actually kind of like, advocate for a better quality of life, especially for our children and for our families. So as the legislative session comes around, following January of next year, we're going to have a renewed call to action to support all of these bills. So we definitely want folks to jump in on this. So yeah, thank you, Jess. maindigenousagenda.org. So I'm going to stop the share again. If there's anybody that wants to come off mute and ask a question, I'll do my best to field that.
Jean-Luc,
Hi.
how are you teaching your current youth and adults that haven't grown up in your culture what their background is?
Yeah, I think that so a couple of things. I in my own community, the Tunica Biloxi tribe of Louisiana, just alluded to this, that I actually work and help to continue my family's work of language and culture preservation. So we do things like online classes so that people can learn their own language and learn some of the oral tradition, the old stories. These are things that we hope to ground, in terms of like that public education and that outreach that my family has done. I mean, it could come down to like weekly, we had weekly cultural demonstrations for our tribal members and for the outside community. We've done those online classes. We've made ourselves available for all kinds of different festivals and powwows, and being on planning committees for that. And really, like, driving home, a lot of the sort of like multilingual, multicultural ways in which we root ourselves, and that's within my own tribe back in Louisiana. For the folks here in Boston, of course, we have our host tribes. They have their own traditions and their things like that. But when we're talking about urban Indigenous peoples, and we're talking about these situations in which generations were stolen from us, the children that were lost to residential and boarding schools, in ways in which systemically we were driven away from our identity, and our ways of knowing. What we do is we actually just hold space. Part of it is, what we do is not necessarily like, yes, these are protests, when we have, say for instance, National Day of Mourning that they have pictured behind me, or the Orange Shirt Day or whatever. But we hold these spaces so that people can actually kind of like come out and speak to their own lived experiences, and be able to kind of like form those connections and kind of piece together what has happened to our peoples over the decades, over the years, and what's happening right now. So I think it's really just, being able to, go out into the community, hold those spaces so that people can kind of publicly speak to their lived experience, in a more organizational way of being, it's just keeping our doors open, and making sure that our staff is there to have the types of discussions that people need to have to be able to express what's going on with them right now. Because we have women in our community that are affected by sexual assaults and domestic violence, or the pandemic of missing and murdered Indigenous peoples, being able to share those stories. So it really comes down to, not necessarily prescribing one way of like discovering yourself or reconnecting, but it is really about how much, how good of a job we do of holding space, and providing that so that people can share their own stories.
It would be good to hear more of the background of individual tribes.
Mm.
We don't hear enough of it, out in the general public.
Yeah, and just to kind of like give you the kind of the scope of that, kind of like see sort of like the overview of that. It's about, okay, so 1976, then Governor Dukakis put forward an executive order that said, this is the way in which we're going to have Indian affairs within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. At that time, there were bands of Wampanoag and Nipmuc that were recognized on the state level, and then there were other bands that were kind of reclaiming a recognized status. So this even goes back to 1861 and the Earl Report, where within Massachusetts there were 16 tribes, and you have tribes, you have communities that continue those lines of families, of continuing the sovereign tribal governments. But you have bands of Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Massachusetts, Abenaki, but then you have even sort of like Massachusetts itself. It didn't used to have the borders that we have now. We're talking about the Bay Colony of Massachusetts, the province of Massachusetts that had borders that extended into Maine. And so what do you do with all of those tribes? All of the tribes that are like the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, the Maliseet, the Mi'kmaq, all of those tribes had historical government-to-government relationships with Massachusetts. And so under that executive order, there was the Boston Indian Council, now North American Indian Center of Boston. We were helping to liaise between those tribes, members of those tribes, and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. But even more than that, When you go back 345 years ago, you have tribes from this region that were pushed out um, from here because of King Philip's War. And so you have tribes such as the Abenaki that are in Quebec, or the Delaware that are out in Oklahoma, that still maintain ancestral and cultural ties to this area. And we see that even more so when we have advocacy around sites such as the Boston Harbor Islands, and Long Island and Deer Island, where there are graves of people. And so it really, it really kind of boggles the mind. It going from sort of like, well, in Massachusetts, there are two federally recognized tribes, into the sort of like this world where you're dealing with like over 30 tribes that could be, inside or outside of the current borders. And all of the peoples that come to Boston because of that legacy of urban relocation. There are many different peoples that are here. And we are coming to the point where we're actually, from NACOP's standpoint, especially during the pandemic, we're providing services for our relatives from Central and South America. Organizations such as Mayans Without Borders, or Quechua-speaking congregations out in Milford. So we're finding more and more indigenous peoples. So there's definitely like so many different peoples that are here. But when we're talking about, being on this land, being, on the land that holds us and sustains us, and whose ancestors are buried here, we definitely start with like the Massachusetts, the Wampanoag, the Nipmuc, the Abenaki, and so forth. So, but you have to kind of understand that, the descendants are still around, and they're still out there. It's just kind of like, kind of forming the connections with the land, and then finding out, where those connections kind of take you, and learning about who your neighbors are. So I hope that's not too mind-boggling. I know it's a lot.
That, do you know if each state is attempting the same legislature?
As far as like the Massachusetts Indigenous Legislative Agenda, and there are, there definitely, this is not something that's like an invention of us in Massachusetts. We base our work on national and efforts within other states. And so, when you're talking about something such as, Indigenous Peoples Day, it has a history of advocacy going back to the 1990s. When we're talking about what does it mean to refine NAGPRA enforcement? These are things that Indigenous peoples are faced with across the United States. And so, yes, we definitely, we're not necessarily in the position right now where we're working in coalition across state lines for, parallel Indigenous agendas. But given time, and given successes, I think that our work here is just kind of like helping to interweave that broader effort to advocate for Indigenous rights and peoples. So
the Episcopal Church the last couple of years has been extending their efforts to work with the Indigenous people in Reformation.
Yeah, definitely, like, there's a awakening of consciousness, especially when it comes to like those issues around the residential and boarding schools, and sort of like the culpability of organized religion. I think that, the Episcopal Church, the UUs, the Unitarian Church, that there are definitely like some of our staunchest allies. So, really, we do have people within congregations that are working intently on advocating for rights and for our Indigenous agenda. Yeah. I just wanted to just kind of like uplift a couple of things that were shared in the chat. Joyce is saying this has been so informative and wonderfully presented. Thank you. Can you talk more about the importance of land acknowledgements by large institutions such as Harvard and the Boston Public Library? I think more institutions need to do that. And Carrie shared, do you think there will be more opportunities for your political agenda with the new governor of Mass, Maura Healey? So the thing about, okay, so the importance of land acknowledgements by large institutions such as Harvard and the Boston Public Library is that, and this is, it's not just, so it's not just the platitude, it's not just about the Googleable facts about the land that we're on, but it's kind of, finding, what is sort of like the overall need to acknowledge, but then to put that acknowledgement into action. And so, a land acknowledgement by, institutions such as Harvard, needs to be coupled with actions such as like, what does it mean to increase access to educational programming, like more Native students? Because it's Harvard College started off as another one of these institutions for Indian education. So you need more Native students, you need more tenured professors. But then also, some of the things that Harvard is engaging with right now in terms of investigating their history with slavery, not just with enslaved Africans, but from Indigenous peoples that were taken from these shores. So, these are some of the things like, yes, a land acknowledgement by Harvard is good, but it's not just something we say at the beginning of events. It's what are we putting into action, and what is kind of like the legacy of harm that institutions have been have been sort of complicit with. Boston Public Library, again, thinking about like these places in which data, it could be, language data or history. How can we actually like open up these archives so that the Indigenous peoples that very much need to sort of like reclaim our histories, reclaim our cultural data from all of these institutions? What are these institutions putting into action to actually repair those relationships? And so that, going back to sort of like that example with the Mohegan and sort of like the intellectual property owned in common by the Indigenous nations. These are the types of things that we're talking about. And with the midterm election, we're looking at, of course, with Maura Healey, with our new Lieutenant Governor Kim Driscoll, the Attorney General Andrea Campbell. We're looking to have those one-on-one meetings and sort of like presenting the overall ideas and ideals of the Massachusetts Indigenous legislative agenda, and looking to build those bridges with state government. And of course, we're looking at all the legislators that are going to be coming in next session. We're looking for the advocates within the legislature. Of course, in Jamaica Plain, I'm not sure if folks in Chelmsford are familiar with State Representative Nika Aligardo, but she was a very good advocate that took our issues to heart, and was a lead sponsor on almost every bill within the legislative agenda. And so we're looking for those folks that are bold, that are progressive, that are willing to take our issues to heart and really, do the most so that we can get all of these bills to a floor vote, because this is the bare minimum. This is a starting point for Massachusetts. But when we're looking at the most recent events, such as like the oral arguments in the Brackeen case at the Supreme Court of the United States, which could end up overturning the Indian Child Welfare Act. We need legislators that are going to partner with us in rapid response to be able to have those protections so that Native children can stay within Native homes. And not go back to the days in which our children are separated from our families and from our communities. So we really, at this point, after the midterm elections and going into the next session, going into all of the next gubernatorial administration, we really need to build those bridges. And we need folks to call Maura Healey and say, look, what are you doing to support the Indigenous agenda? So again, that's another thing that folks in Chelmsford can help us out with. Thank you. So it's 10 past the hour. I'm gonna hand it back to you, Jess.
Thank you so much, John. That was a really amazing presentation. Thank you for being so thorough and so thoughtful, and so really educating us on what we can do and why. I am going to share this recording with everybody tomorrow, so you can go back, look at all of those wonderful resources and the history and the contemporary culture, and also some of the resources that John Luke mentioned at the end there, way you can connect and help. And also some more information about the general project that we have going on here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just one more thing I do want to make sure. So we did do maindigenousagenda.org.
Mhm.
Definitely go to NACOB.org. That'll give you all of the information around North American Indian Center of Boston. Find out about our upcoming events. Find out about ways in which you can donate to the center. I would be remiss and really given the talking to by my executive director, right, if I didn't do some fundraising. But also go to UAINE.org, United American Indians of New England.org. You can find information around the organization. You can find information around National Day of Mourning, and in ways in which you can support our very close partner. So really appreciate the opportunity to share those URLs.
Thank you so much. And I'll include those in the message tomorrow too. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight and for staying on with us and asking great questions. I hope, Jean-Luc, that you had a great experience as well. And we really appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Have a great night, everyone.